Welcome. I'm glad you're here. Wherever you are right now, whatever brought you to this moment, you've done enough for today. You've carried what needed carrying. You've walked the paths that were yours to walk. And now, it's time to set it all down. Let your body find the place where it can truly rest. Feel the surface beneath you. Notice how it holds you without effort, without asking anything in return. Your shoulders can soften, your jaw can release. Even your thoughts can begin to slow, like leaves settling after wind. Tonight, we're going to the mountains. Not the mountains of maps and trails, but the mountains of old stories, where monks walked centuries ago, where silence grew thick as fog, and where stillness was not something to achieve, but something to remember. These are gentle tales, soft and slow, and they ask nothing of you except that you listen, and when listening becomes too much, that you simply let go and sleep. There is no right way to hear these stories. You may drift in and out. You may hear only fragments. You may fall asleep before the first story ends, and that would be perfect. These words will continue whether you hear them or not, like a river flowing past a sleeping village. So breathe, softly, slowly. Let the day finish itself without you. Let tonight be a threshold you don't have to cross alone. I'll be here, telling these old tales, and you can rest. The first story begins in a time that feels both long ago and strangely close, in a monastery built into the side of a mountain so remote that even the wind arrived late. There was a monk who lived in that monastery, though lived is perhaps too strong a word. He existed there. He moved through the halls like water through stone, leaving no trace, making no sound. His name, if he ever had one, had been forgotten long ago, even by himself. The other monks called him Brother Stillness, though never to his face, for he was rarely near enough to hear. This monk owned nothing, not in the way of vows or discipline, but in the way of forgetting. He had simply stopped accumulating. His room held a mat, a blanket thin as paper, and a small wooden cup. That was all. Once, years before, he had owned a second robe, but he left it on a branch one autumn morning and never thought of it again. A passing traveler found it and was grateful. The monk never knew. Every morning, Brother Stillness woke before the first birds. The sky would still be deep and black, and the stars over the mountains would be sharp as needles. He would sit on his mat and watch his breath appear and disappear in the cold air of his room. He did not meditate in the formal sense. He simply sat, the way a stone sits, the way a mountain sits. After a time, he would rise and walk. His walking was his practice. He walked the same path every day, a narrow trail that wound through a forest of pine and cedar, up a slope, across a meadow, and then to a cliff edge where the land fell away into mist. The path took 2 hours to walk, and he walked it slowly, so slowly that sometimes birds would land near his feet, mistaking him for something inanimate. One winter morning, as he walked, the snow began to fall. It fell silently, the way snow does in deep forests, each flake distinct and unhurried. Brother Stillness continued walking. The snow gathered on his shoulders, on his shaved head, on the tops of his bare feet. He did not brush it away. He did not hurry. By the time he reached the meadow, the snow was ankle deep and still falling. The sky was white, the ground was white, the air between them was white. He stood in the center of the meadow, and for a moment, it was impossible to say where the earth ended and the sky began. He stood there, becoming indistinguishable from the world around him, and then he continued walking. When he reached the cliff edge, he stopped. Below him, the valley was hidden in cloud. Above him, the sky was hidden in snow. He stood at the edge of the world, or what felt like the edge, and he realized he could not remember why he had come. He had been walking this path for so many years that the reason had worn away, the way water wears away stone. He stood there for a long time. The snow continued. His breath rose and vanished, and then, without ceremony, he turned and walked back. On the return journey, he met another monk coming up the path. This monk was younger, his robes newer, his eyes still full of questions. The younger monk stopped and bowed. "Brother," the younger monk said, "may I walk with you?" Brother Stillness said nothing, but he did not walk away, and so the younger monk fell into step beside him. They walked together in silence for a long time, the snow falling around them, the forest dark and close on either side. Finally, the younger monk spoke. "Forgive me, brother, but I must ask. I have watched you walk this path every day since I arrived. You wake before everyone. You walk for hours, and then you return and sit in silence until the evening meal. What are you seeking?" Brother Stillness continued walking. His feet pressed into the snow, leaving shallow prints that were already beginning to fill. He did not answer. The younger monk tried again. "Is there something at the end of the path? A shrine? A teacher? A vision?" Brother Stillness stopped walking. He turned and looked at the younger monk. His face was calm, empty of expression, but not unkind. He said, "I carry nothing there. I bring nothing back." The younger monk frowned. "Then why go at all?" Brother Stillness looked up at the sky, at the snow falling from nowhere into nowhere. He said, "Because the path does not ask why." And then he continued walking. The younger monk stood in the snow, confused, perhaps a little frustrated, but something in the older monk's words, or perhaps in his silence, settled into him. He followed. They reached the monastery as the light was failing. The snow had stopped, and the sky had cleared enough to show a pale wash of stars. Brother Stillness went to his room, removed his wet robe, and sat on his mat. The younger monk stood in the doorway. "Brother," he said quietly, "may I ask one more question?" Brother Stillness did not turn, but he inclined his head slightly. "Do you ever tire of the path?" Brother Stillness was silent for a moment. Then he said, "The path tires of nothing. It is always only itself. I am the one who sometimes remembers I am walking." The younger monk bowed and left. That night, as the monastery settled into sleep, Brother Stillness sat in his small room and looked at the wooden cup beside his mat. It was old, smooth from years of use, darkened by the oils of his hands. He had owned it longer than anything else. He picked it up and turned it in his hands, feeling its weight, its simplicity. He thought about the younger monk's question. Why go at all? He did not have an answer, but he did not need one. The cup in his hands was a cup. The mat beneath him was a mat. The walls around him were walls. And he was a man who walked a path every morning, not because the path led somewhere, but because walking was what happened. Seeking was what happened. And stillness, eventually, was what remained. He set the cup down and lay on his mat. The blanket was thin, but the cold did not bother him. He closed his eyes and listened to the silence of the monastery, the silence of the mountains, the silence of the snow settling outside his window. And somewhere in that silence, he disappeared into sleep, carrying nothing, leaving nothing, simply gone. Winter deepened. The snow piled high against the monastery walls. The paths became difficult, then impossible. The monks stayed indoors, huddling near braziers, mending robes, copying sutras by candlelight. But Brother Stillness continued his walk. Every morning, he rose in the dark, wrapped his robe around him, and stepped out into the frozen world. The other monks watched him go. Some thought him foolish, some thought him enlightened, most simply thought him strange, and strangeness in a monastery was common enough not to warrant much attention. One morning, after a night of heavy snow, Brother Stillness opened the door of the monastery and found the path completely erased. The forest was buried, the meadow was indistinguishable from the sky. Everything was white and trackless. He stood in the doorway, the cold air moving against his face, and he looked out at the obliterated world. He stepped forward anyway. He walked into the snow, which rose to his knees, then his thighs. He walked without a path, without direction, simply forward. His body moved slowly, each step an effort, but his mind was quiet. He was not trying to reach the meadow. He was not trying to reach the cliff. He was simply walking, because walking was what he did. After an hour, he stopped. He had no idea where he was. The monastery was hidden behind him, invisible in the white. The cliff was somewhere ahead, or to the side, or behind him. Now he could not say. He stood in the snow, breathing, and he realized he was lost. He stood there for a long time, waiting for fear, waiting for urgency, waiting for the instinct to survive to take hold and turn him around, but nothing came. He was lost, and it did not matter. The snow fell, his breath rose. The world was white and soft and utterly without reference. He sat down in the snow. He crossed his legs, rested his hands on his knees, and closed his eyes. The cold soaked into his robe, into his skin, into his bones. He did not move. He sat the way he sat every morning on his mat, the way a stone sits, the way a mountain sits. He sat and waited for nothing. Time passed. He could not say how much. The cold became numbness. The numbness became something else, something that felt almost like warmth. His breath slowed, his heartbeat slowed, and in the absolute stillness of that white world, he felt something he had been walking toward for years without knowing it. He felt the path disappear. Not the path in the snow, but the path in his mind. The path he had been walking every morning, the path of seeking, of moving towards something, even if that something was nothing. The path itself dissolved, and what remained was only this: snow, breath, silence. He opened his eyes. The world was still white, but it no longer felt empty. It felt full, full of snow, full of cold, full of presence. He stood up slowly, his legs stiff, his body trembling slightly from the cold. He turned in a slow circle, looking at the featureless landscape, and then he began to walk. He did not walk toward the monastery. He did not walk away from it. He simply walked, and after a time, the trees began to appear, dark shapes emerging from the white. He followed them, not as a path, but as a presence, and eventually, he found himself standing in front of the monastery door. He went inside. He removed his robe, now heavy with snow, and sat on his mat. The younger monk appeared in the doorway, his face concerned. "Brother, we thought you were lost. The snow." Brother Stillness looked at him. "I was." The younger monk hesitated. "But you found your way back." Brother Stillness shook his head slowly. "No." The younger monk did not understand, but he nodded and left. That night, Brother Stillness did not sleep right away. He sat on his mat and looked at the wooden cup, the thin blanket, the bare walls. He thought about the path he had walked for so many years, and he realized it had never been about reaching the cliff, or the meadow or any destination. It had been about walking until the walking itself disappeared, until there was no one walking and no path to walk, only the simple fact of being here, now, without cause or direction. He picked up the cup and drank from it, though it was empty. The gesture itself was enough. The next morning, he did not wake before the birds. He woke with them as the first gray light touched the mountains. He did not walk the path. He sat on his mat and watched the light change, the way it moved across the wall, the way it softened and grew. He sat until the sun was full in the sky, and then he stood and went to the meditation hall where the other monks were chanting. He joined them, his voice low and rough from disuse, but present. He chanted with them, and when the chanting ended, he bowed and returned to his room. He spent the day sitting, not meditating, not thinking, simply sitting. And when evening came, he ate his meal with the others in silence, and then returned to his room and slept. The younger monk noticed. Over the following days, he saw that Brother Stillness no longer walked the path. He no longer woke before everyone. He simply existed within the rhythms of the monastery, present but not performing, still but not separate. One evening, the younger monk approached him as he sat outside, watching the stars emerge over the mountains. "Brother," the younger monk said, "you have stopped walking the path." Brother Stillness nodded. "Have you found what you were seeking?" Brother Stillness was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I was never seeking. I was only walking, and now I am only sitting. Tomorrow, perhaps I will walk again, or perhaps I will sit. It does not matter." The younger monk sat down beside him. They watched the stars together, the night deepening around them, the mountains vast and silent. After a while, the younger monk said, "I do not understand." Brother Stillness smiled, a small, barely visible expression. "Good." They sat together until the cold drove them inside. Brother Stillness returned to his room, lay down on his mat, and pulled the thin blanket over himself. He closed his eyes and felt the weight of his body, the stillness of the night, the slow unwinding of his breath. And somewhere in that unwinding, he let go of even the need to let go, and sleep came, soft and complete, like snow covering everything. Years passed. The younger monk became an older monk. Brother Stillness remained, though he grew thinner, quieter, more translucent, as if he were slowly becoming the air itself. He still walked sometimes, though not every day, and never the same path twice. He still sat, though not in meditation, simply in existence. And the other monks, who had once found him strange, began to feel a kind of peace in his presence, as if his stillness was contagious, spreading through the monastery like warmth from a fire. One spring morning, as the snow was melting and the first flowers were opening in the meadow, Brother Stillness did not wake. His body was found on his mat, his face calm, his hands resting lightly on his chest. The wooden cup was beside him, empty as always. The thin blanket covered him, and in the morning light, he looked as if he were only sleeping. The monks carried him to the cliff edge, the place he had walked to so many times. They built a simple pyre and set his body on it, and as the flames rose, they chanted softly, the words carried away by the wind. His ashes drifted out over the valley, mingling with the mist, becoming indistinguishable from the air, the light, the mountain itself. The younger monk, now older, stood at the cliff edge long after the others had returned to the monastery. He looked out at the valley, the mountains, the endless sky, and he thought about Brother Stillness, the monk who carried nothing, who sought nothing, who found nothing, and in finding nothing, had somehow found everything. He turned and walked back down the path, slowly, the way Brother Stillness had walked, each step deliberate, each step dissolving into the next. And as he walked, he felt the path beneath his feet, not as a line from here to there, but as a presence, a way of being that had no beginning and no end, only the quiet, steady fact of walking, of breathing, of being alive in a world that asked nothing but presence. When he reached the monastery, he went to his room and sat on his mat. He looked at his few possessions, a robe, a blanket, a cup, and he thought about what to let go of next. But then he realized there was nothing to let go of, because he was not holding anything. He was only here, only now, only this breath, this moment, this stillness that had always been present, waiting beneath the noise of seeking. He closed his eyes and felt the monastery settle around him. The mountains settle around the monastery, the sky settle around the mountains. And in that settling, he understood what Brother Stillness had been teaching all along, not with words, but with his walking, his sitting, his slow disappearance into the world. The teaching was this: carry nothing, and you will never be lost. Seek nothing, and you will always arrive. Be still, and the path will walk you. He sat until the light faded, until the stars appeared, until the monastery was silent and the mountains were dark. And then, like Brother Stillness before him, he lay down and let sleep carry him away into the stillness that has no name, no form, no boundary, only the quiet fact of being, here, now, always. And somewhere not far from here, in a small house on the edge of a village that no longer exists, there lived a man who was known, by those who knew him, as the Tea Master. His name was Kenji, though few called him that. He was simply the Tea Master, and his house was simply the tea house, and everything about him was simple in the way that deep rivers are simple, moving with such constancy that their movement becomes stillness. Kenji had lived in the village for longer than anyone could remember. Some said he had been there when the village was founded. Others said he had arrived one winter and never left. No one knew for certain, and Kenji never spoke of his past. He lived alone in a house of wood and paper, with a small garden, a well, a room for tea, and very little else. Every morning, Kenji would wake with the first light. He would open the sliding doors of his house and look out at the garden. The garden was small, barely 10 paces across, but it held everything: a stone lantern, a maple tree, a bed of moss, a few careful stones arranged to suggest a mountain range. Kenji would stand in the doorway and look at the garden as if seeing it for the first time, though he had seen it 10,000 times before. Then he would go to the well, draw water, and begin the long, slow process of preparing tea. Kenji's tea ceremony was not like the ceremonies performed in the great houses or the temples. There were no formal guests, no prescribed movements, no rigid adherence to tradition. Kenji simply made tea, and in the making, there was a kind of perfection that had nothing to do with correctness and everything to do with presence. He would heat the water slowly, listening to the sound it made as it began to simmer, the sound the old masters called the wind in the pines. He would prepare the tea leaves, measuring them by feel, by intuition, by a knowledge that lived in his hands rather than his mind. He would whisk the tea in a bowl that was old and simple, its glaze cracked in a way that made it more beautiful, not less. And then he would sit, alone in his tea room, and drink. He drank slowly, the way one might drink from a mountain stream after a long journey. He drank as if the tea were the only thing in the world, and in those moments it was. The taste, the warmth, the slight bitterness, the fading sweetness, all of it filled his awareness completely, leaving no room for thought, for memory, for the constant hum of wanting and not wanting that occupies most minds. When the tea was finished, he would rinse the bowl, dry it, and set it back in its place. Then he would sit for a while longer, looking out at the garden, at the light moving through the leaves of the maple tree, at the moss darkening with dew. This was his practice. This was his life. People came to Kenji for tea, though not often. He did not advertise. He did not teach. He simply lived, and sometimes, when someone knocked on his door with the right kind of question in their heart, he would invite them in. One autumn afternoon, a young woman came to his door. She was a merchant's daughter from a nearby town, and she had heard of the tea master from a traveler. The traveler had said, "If you are troubled, go to Kenji. He will not give you answers, but he will give you tea, and sometimes that is enough." The young woman was indeed troubled. Her father had arranged a marriage for her, a good marriage by all accounts, to a man of standing and wealth, but she did not love him. She did not even know him, and the wedding was only weeks away. She felt as if her life were a river being diverted into a channel she had not chosen, and she did not know how to say no, or even if she wanted to say no. She only knew she was afraid and confused and very, very tired. She knocked on Kenji's door. He opened it, looked at her for a moment, and then stepped aside. "Come in." She entered and removed her shoes. The house was bare, almost empty, but it did not feel cold. It felt held, as if the walls themselves were a kind of embrace. Kenji led her to the tea room, and she sat on a cushion while he prepared the tea. She watched him work. He moved without hurry, without hesitation. Every gesture was complete in itself, not reaching toward the next moment, not lingering in the last. He heated the water. He measured the tea. He whisked it into foam, and then he placed the bowl in front of her. "Drink," he said. She lifted the bowl and drank. The tea was bitter at first, then sweet, then bitter again. She drank it all, and when she set the bowl down, she realized she had not thought about her wedding, or her father, or her fear. For the space of that drinking, she had been nowhere but here. Kenji refilled the bowl and drank himself. Then he set it down and looked at her. "You have come with a question," he said. "Yes." Her voice was quiet. "I don't know what to do." "About what?" "My life, my marriage, everything." Kenji nodded. He looked out at the garden, where the maple tree was beginning to turn red. "Tell me," he said, "when you drink tea, what do you taste?" She blinked, confused. "Tea, only tea." She thought about it. Bitterness, sweetness, warmth, and when you set the bowl down, where does the taste go? She paused. "It fades." "Does it fade, or does it simply stop being tasted?" She did not know how to answer. Kenji smiled, a small, gentle smile. "The tea does not disappear. It becomes part of you. But the tasting, the moment of tasting that is finished, it does not linger unless you hold it. Do you understand?" "I think so." "Your question," Kenji said, "is not about what to do. It is about what you are holding that you think you should not let go, and what you are not holding that you think you should." She looked down at her hands. "I don't want to disappoint my father. That is what you are holding. And I don't know if I want this marriage. That is what you are not holding." She felt tears prick her eyes. "But how do I know? How do I choose?" Kenji picked up the tea bowl and turned it in his hands. "This bowl is cracked," he said. "Do you see?" She looked. The glaze was crisscrossed with fine lines, a web of imperfections. These cracks came from use, Kenji said, from heat and cold, from being filled and emptied again and again. The bowl did not choose to crack. It simply lived, and cracks were what happened. But now, because of the cracks, the bowl is more beautiful. The tea tastes better in it. Do you know why? She shook her head. Because the bowl is no longer trying to be perfect. It is only trying to be a bowl. He set the bowl down and looked at her. You are afraid of cracking, but you are already cracked. Everyone is. The question is not whether to avoid the cracks. The question is whether to fill yourself with something worth tasting. She sat with his words. They did not make sense in the way that instructions make sense, but they settled into her like the tea had settled into her, warm and bitter and true. What should I do? She asked again, though the question felt different now. Kenji shrugged. Drink tea, sit in the garden, watch the leaves fall, and when it is time to choose, you will choose, or you will not choose. Either way, the tea will still be tea. She stayed for another hour, sitting in silence, while Kenji tended the garden, trimmed a branch, swept the path. When she finally rose to leave, she bowed deeply. Thank you, she said. Kenji nodded. Come back when you need tea. She left, and as she walked down the path away from his house, she felt something shift inside her. She did not know what she would do about the marriage. She did not know what she would say to her father, but she knew that she would not decide from fear. She would decide from the place where the tea had taken her, the place where nothing was held too tightly and nothing was refused too quickly. Weeks passed. Kenji continued his life as he always had, waking with the light, making tea, tending the garden. He did not think about the young woman. He did not wonder what she had decided. He simply lived, and living was enough. One morning, she returned. She knocked on his door, and when he opened it, he saw that her face was different. Not happier, necessarily, but clearer, as if a fog had lifted. I did not marry him, she said. Kenji nodded. Come in. She sat in the tea room while he prepared tea. They drank together in silence, and when the tea was finished, she said, My father was angry. He will not speak to me. I have moved to a small house on the other side of the village, and I work as a seamstress. I have very little. And how is the tea? Kenji asked. She smiled, a real smile, the first he had seen from her. The tea is good. They sat together for a while longer, and then she left. She did not come back often, but she came sometimes, once a season, once a year, whenever she felt the need to sit in that small, bare room and drink tea with a man who asked nothing of her and gave nothing but presents. Years passed. The young woman became an older woman. She married eventually to a man she chose herself, and they had children, and the children grew. Life cracked her, as life cracks everyone, but she did not break. She bent, she adapted, she filled herself with what was worth tasting, and when the cracks came, she let them come, knowing they were not failures but simply the evidence of having lived. Kenji grew older too, though he did not seem to change. His hair whitened, his hands grew more gnarled, but his movements remained slow and deliberate. His presence remained still, and his tea remained perfect in its imperfection. One winter morning, after a night of snow, Kenji woke and knew that this was his last day. He did not know how he knew. There was no pain, no illness, only a quiet certainty, the way one knows when a story is ending. He rose and made tea, as he always did. He drank it slowly, savoring every sip, though he had savored every sip of every cup for his entire life. He looked out at the garden, now covered in snow, the maple tree bare, the stones hidden beneath white, and he felt a deep satisfaction, not because his life had been long or because he had accomplished anything, but simply because he had been here, fully, in every moment, tasting the tea, watching the leaves, breathing the air. When the tea was finished, he rinsed the bowl, dried it, and set it back in its place. Then he sat in the center of the tea room, his legs crossed, his hands resting on his knees, and he closed his eyes. He did not meditate, he did not pray. He simply sat the way he had sat 10,000 times before, and he let his breath slow, let his heartbeat slow, let the boundary between himself and the world dissolve like steam rising from tea. And then, quietly, without ceremony, he stopped. The villagers found him the next morning, still sitting, his face calm, his body cold. They carried him to the temple and burned him, and his ashes were scattered in the garden he had tended for so long. The tea house stood empty for a time, and then it fell into disrepair, and then it disappeared entirely, as all things do. But the bowl remained, the cracked, beautiful bowl that had held so much tea, so many moments, so much presence. It was given to the woman who had first come to Kenji with her question, and she kept it for the rest of her life, using it every morning to drink tea, alone in her small house, remembering the man who had taught her that life was not about avoiding cracks, but about filling them with something worth tasting. And when she was old, very old, she passed the bowl to her daughter, and her daughter passed it to her daughter, and the bowl continued, cracked and beautiful, a reminder that nothing lasts, but everything matters, and the tea, always, is only tea. And there, beneath a sky scattered with stars, in a valley where time moved like honey, there was a stone. It was not a remarkable stone. It was gray, flecked with mica that caught the light when the sun hit it at certain angles. It was smooth on one side, rough on the other, and it was roughly the size of a human head, though no one was there to measure it or compare it to anything. The stone sat in a riverbed that had long since dried. Once, water had rushed over it, wearing it smooth, tumbling it along with 1,000 other stones. But the river had changed its course, or the climate had changed, or the mountains had shifted, and now the riverbed was dry, filled with dust and the brittle remnants of plants that had given up trying. The stone sat in this dry bed for a long time, years, decades, centuries perhaps. It had no way of knowing. It simply sat, enduring the heat of summer and the cold of winter, the occasional rain, the wind that carried dust and seeds and sometimes small insects that crawled across its surface before moving on. If the stone had thoughts, which it did not, it might have been lonely. It might have longed for the river that once moved it, the water that once surrounded it, the constant motion that had defined the first part of its existence. But stones do not think, do not long, and so the stone simply sat, neither content nor discontent, simply present. One spring, a seed landed in a crack on the stone's rough side. The seed was small, carried by wind from a tree that grew far away, and it settled into the crack as if it had always belonged there. Rain came, not much, but enough. The seed absorbed the water, swelled, and sent out a tendril of root that pushed deeper into the crack, seeking purchase, seeking soil that was not there. The root found only stone. But roots are persistent, and this one did not give up. It pushed and probed, widening the crack by a fraction, and then a fraction more. Days passed, weeks. The root grew thicker, stronger, and the crack grew wider. The stone, if it could feel, might have been alarmed. it might have resisted. But stones do not resist, and so the crack simply widened, and the roots simply grew, and the two existed together in a kind of slow, patient dance that had no audience and no end in sight. By summer, a tiny green shoot emerged from the crack. It was thin as a thread, pale from the lack of sun, but it reached upward with the same persistence as the root had reached downward. The shoot unfurled 2 leaves, each no bigger than a fingernail, and the leaves turned toward the sun and began the slow work of making food from light. The stone sat beneath the growing plant, unchanged, unaware, simply being. Seasons passed, the plant grew. It was a hardy species, the kind that thrives in impossible places, and it sent more roots into the crack, widening it further, anchoring itself more firmly. The stone, which had sat unmoved for centuries, began to feel the first stirrings of change. The crack that had once been a hairline fracture was now a fissure, deep and widening, and the stone, very slowly, began to split. If the stone had a voice, it might have cried out. But stones do not cry, and so the splitting happened in silence. Over years, over decades, the plant growing taller, the roots growing deeper, the stone dividing into 2 pieces that sat side by side, still touching but no longer whole. A monk came to the valley. He was an old monk, traveling alone, and he had been walking for a long time, long enough that his feet were calloused and his robes were tattered and his mind was quiet in the way that only long walking can make a mind quiet. He saw the stone split by the plant, and he stopped. He set down his bundle and knelt beside the stone, studying it. The plant was small but strong, its roots visible in the widening crack, its leaves green and reaching. The stone was gray and patient, split but not broken, still holding the plant, still offering it a place to grow. The monk sat beside the stone for a long time. He did not touch it. He did not pray or meditate. He simply sat, the way stones sit, the way plants grow, without intention, without purpose, simply being. After a while, he spoke, though there was no one to hear. "You have learned to wait," he said to the stone, "and now you are teaching me." He stayed beside the stone for the rest of the day, watching the light change, watching the shadows move, watching the plant's leaves turn to follow the sun. And as he watched, he thought about his own life, the way he had been split by time, by loss, by the slow, patient work of simply living. He thought about the way he had resisted, the way he had clung to wholeness, the way he had feared the cracks. And then he thought about the stone, which had not resisted, which had not clung, which had simply allowed the splitting to happen, and in the splitting had given life to something new. When evening came, the monk rose, picked up his bundle, and continued walking. But he carried the stone with him now, not the physical stone, but the lesson of it, the quiet teaching that came from simply being patient, simply allowing, simply waiting for the cracks to widen and the new thing to emerge. The stone remained in the valley. The plant continued to grow. Years passed, and the 2 pieces of the stone drifted further apart, pushed by the expanding roots, by the wind, by the slow settling of the earth. Eventually, the plant grew tall enough to flower, and the flowers produced seeds, and the seeds were carried by wind to other places, where they would land in other cracks, in other stones, and the cycle would continue. The stone, now in 2 pieces, sat in the dry riverbed and waited. It did not wait for anything in particular. It simply waited, the way stones wait, with infinite patience, with no expectation, with no desire for the waiting to end. One day, the rains returned. Not a single rain, but a season of rains, heavy and sustained, and the dry riverbed began to fill. Water trickled at first, then flowed, and then rushed, and the stone, both pieces of it, were lifted by the current and carried downstream. The two pieces tumbled together for a while, then separated, carried by different currents to different places. One piece lodged beneath a willow tree, where it would sit for another century, becoming part of the bank, offering stability to the tree's roots. The other piece was carried further, out of the valley, down into a wider river, and eventually to the sea, where it would be tumbled smooth again, becoming sand, becoming part of the beach, becoming something new. But before the splitting, before the flowing, before the transformation, there was the waiting. There was the stone, sitting in the dry riverbed, patient and still, allowing the crack, allowing the root, allowing the slow work of time to do what time does. And in that waiting, the stone taught what stones teach, that nothing lasts, that everything changes, that resistance is futile, and that patience is not passive but the deepest form of participation in the unfolding of the world. The monk who had sat beside the stone eventually reached the end of his journey, though the end was not a place but simply a stopping. He found a small temple in the mountains, and he stayed there, tending the garden, sweeping the paths, sitting in meditation and teaching. When anyone came to learn the lesson the stone had taught him, he would say, "Be like the stone, wait. Do not resist the crack, do not fear the splitting. Allow the root to grow, and when you are divided, do not mourn the wholeness you have lost. Celebrate the new thing that has taken root in you." And the students would listen, some understanding, some not, but all of them carrying the teaching forward into their own lives, into their own waiting, into their own slow, patient transformation. And somewhere, in a valley far away, a stone sat beside a river, smooth and gray, waiting for nothing, becoming nothing, being everything. And in the high mountains, where the air was thin and the silence thick as snow, there lived a hermit. He had no name, or if he did, he had forgotten it. The villagers in the valley below called him the Hermit of the North Peak, though few had ever seen him, and fewer still had spoken to him. He lived in a cave halfway up the mountain, a cave that was barely large enough to lie down in, with a small opening that faced east, toward the rising sun. The hermit had been living in the cave for 20 years. Before that, he had been a scholar, a man of books and debates, a man who believed that understanding could be achieved through thought, through analysis, through the careful dissection of texts and ideas. He had been respected, even famous, in the circles where such things mattered. But one day, in the middle of a lecture, in the middle of a sentence, he had stopped. The students waited. The colleagues waited. The hermit stood at the front of the hall, his mouth open, the words gone, and he realized he had nothing to say. Not because he had forgotten, but because all the words he knew, all the ideas he had studied, all the understanding he had accumulated, suddenly felt empty, like husks without grain. He walked out of the hall, out of the city, and into the mountains. He did not plan it. He simply walked and kept walking until he found the cave. And then he stopped. For the first year, he did nothing. He sat in the cave and watched the light move across the stone walls. He ate what little he could forage: roots, berries, the occasional gift left by a villager who had heard of his presence. He did not meditate. He did not pray. He simply sat, empty, waiting for something to fill the emptiness. Nothing came. The second year was harder. His body weakened. His mind, which had once been sharp and full, became dull and slow. He thought about leaving, about returning to the city, about resuming his old life. But he did not. He stayed, though he could not have said why. The third year, winter came early and stayed late. Snow piled at the mouth of the cave, blocking the entrance, and the hermit was sealed inside. He had no fire, no food, no water except what he could melt from the snow. He lay on the floor of the cave, wrapped in his tattered robe, and he waited to die. But he did not die. The snow melted. Spring came, and when he emerged from the cave, blinking in the bright light, he realized something had changed. He could not name it. He could not describe it. But the emptiness he had felt was no longer empty. It was full of nothing, which was somehow the same as full of everything. He returned to the cave and continued sitting. But now, the sitting was different. It was not waiting. It was not seeking. It was simply sitting, the way a mountain sits, the way the sky sits, present and complete in itself. Years passed. The hermit grew older, thinner, more translucent. His hair and beard grew long and tangled. His skin darkened from the sun and wind. He became part of the mountain, indistinguishable from the rocks and the snow and the silence. One winter, a young man came to the cave. He was a student, seeking answers, seeking wisdom, seeking something he could not name. He had heard of the hermit from a traveler, who had heard of him from a villager, who had heard of him from a monk. The stories said the hermit was enlightened, that he had transcended the world, that he knew the secrets of existence. The young man climbed the mountain, struggling through the snow, his breath ragged, his body exhausted. When he reached the cave, he found the hermit sitting at the entrance, looking out at the valley below. The hermit did not turn, did not acknowledge him. The young man bowed. "Master, I have come seeking wisdom." The hermit did not respond. The young man waited. The wind blew. The snow fell. After a long time, the young man spoke again. "Master, please, I need your teaching." The hermit turned and looked at him. His eyes were pale, almost colorless, like ice. "I have no teaching," he said. His voice was rough, as if unused. "But the stories are wrong." The young man felt a surge of frustration. He had climbed for days. He had risked his life. And now this old man was telling him there was nothing to learn? "Then why are you here?" the young man demanded. "Why do you live like this, alone, in silence, if you have nothing to teach?" The hermit looked back out at the valley. "I am here because I have nowhere else to be." "That's not an answer. It is the only answer." The young man stood there, cold and angry and confused. He wanted to leave, to descend the mountain and never return, but something held him. He sat down beside the hermit, uninvited, and stared out at the valley. They sat together in silence. The snow fell, the wind blew, the light faded. The young man's anger faded too, replaced by a deep, aching tiredness. He had been searching for so long, climbing so many mountains, reading so many books, asking so many questions, and now he sat beside a man who had no answers, and the silence between them felt like the first honest thing he had encountered in years. "What should I do?" the young man asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Sit," the hermit said. "For how long?" "Until you are done sitting. And then you will know." The young man did not understand, but he stayed. He sat beside the hermit as the light faded, as the stars appeared, as the temperature dropped and his body began to shake with cold. He sat until he could not sit any longer, and then he stood and began the descent. As he walked, something shifted inside him. He did not know what, but the questions that had driven him up the mountain felt less urgent now, less sharp. They were still there, but they no longer controlled him. He walked slowly, carefully, and when he reached the valley, he did not seek out another teacher, another mountain, another answer. He simply went home. Years later, the young man, now older, returned to the mountain. He climbed slowly, taking his time, and when he reached the cave, he found it empty. The hermit was gone. There was no body, no sign of where he had gone. Just the cave, open to the sky, filled with snow. The man sat at the entrance of the cave and looked out at the valley. He thought about the hermit, about the silence they had shared, about the teaching that was not a teaching, and he understood, finally, what the hermit had been trying to say. There was nothing to find. There was nothing to achieve. There was only this: the mountain, the sky, the snow, the breath moving in and out of the body. There was only sitting, and when sitting was done, there was standing and walking, and all the small, quiet acts of being alive. He stayed at the cave for 3 days, sitting, sleeping, watching the snow fall, and then he descended, carrying nothing, seeking nothing, simply going home. The cave remained. Seasons passed. Snow fell and melted. Wind blew. The mountain sat, unchanging, patient, indifferent to the stories told about it, to the seekers who climbed it, to the emptiness and fullness that lived in the silence of the high peaks. And somewhere in that silence, the hermit remained, though not as a body, not as a presence, but as a teaching that had no words, a wisdom that had no form, a stillness that was always waiting, always here, for anyone willing to sit and listen. And in a village that time had nearly forgotten, where the houses were old and the streets were narrow and the river ran slow and brown, there was a path. The path led out of the village, through a field, past a small shrine, and into the forest. It was not a well-traveled path. Most villagers had no reason to walk it. It led nowhere in particular, no neighboring village, no temple, no landmark of note. It simply went into the forest and disappeared, swallowed by trees and undergrowth. But one man walked the path every day. His name was Hideo, and he was old, though no one knew exactly how old. He had lived in the village longer than anyone else could remember, and he had been walking the path for just as long. Every morning, Hideo would wake before dawn, dress in his simple robe, and leave his small house at the edge of the village. He would walk through the field, past the shrine, and into the forest. He would walk for an hour, sometimes 2, and then he would turn around and walk back. He did this every day, rain or shine, summer or winter, without fail. The villagers found it odd. Some thought he was mad, others thought he was holy. Most simply accepted it as one of those inexplicable things that old people do, like talking to plants or refusing to eat fish on Tuesdays. One day, a young boy, curious and bold, decided to follow Hideo. The boy's name was Taro, and he was the kind of child who asked too many questions and never accepted because as an answer. He woke early, before even Hideo, and hid by the side of the path, waiting. When Hideo emerged from his house and began his walk, Taro followed at a distance, careful to stay hidden. He watched as Hideo walked through the field, past the shrine, and into the forest. Taro followed, expecting to discover some secret, a hidden temple, a treasure, a meeting with spirits or foxes in disguise. But Hideo simply walked. He walked until the path became faint, overgrown, and then he stopped. He stood in the middle of the forest, surrounded by trees, and he looked around, slowly, as if seeing something Taro could not see. Then he turned and walked back. Taro was disappointed. There was no secret, no treasure, no spirits, just an old man walking to nowhere and back. The next day, Taro followed again, and the day after that, each time, it was the same. Hideo walked to the same spot, stopped, looked around, and returned. Taro could not understand it. What was the point? Why walk all that way just to turn around? Finally, on the fourth day, Taro's curiosity overcame his caution. He stepped out from behind a tree and confronted Hideo. "Old man," he said, "why do you walk this path every day?" Hideo stopped and looked at the boy. His face was lined and weathered, but his eyes were clear. "Why do you follow me?" he asked. Taro blushed. "I wanted to know where you were going." "And did you find out?" "Yes, nowhere." Hideo smiled. "Then you have learned something." "But why?" Taro insisted. "Why walk all this way to nowhere?" Hideo looked down the path, then back at Taro. "Come," he said, "walk with me." Taro followed, and they walked together in silence, the old man and the boy, through the field, past the shrine, into the forest. When they reached the spot where Hideo always stopped, he turned to Taro. "Do you see this place?" Hideo asked. Taro looked around. Trees, undergrowth, a few rocks, nothing special. "Yes." "What do you see?" "Trees, leaves, a path." "And what else?" Taro looked harder. "Nothing." Hideo nodded. "Exactly, nothing. And that is why I come here." Taro frowned. "I don't understand." Hideo sat down on one of the rocks and gestured for Taro to sit beside him. "In the village," Hideo said, "there is always something. Someone needs help. Someone is arguing. Someone is born. Someone dies. There is work to do, food to cook, problems to solve. The village is full of something." "Yes," Taro said. So here, there is nothing. No people, no problems, no noise, just trees and air and the sound of leaves. And when I come here, I remember that I am also nothing. Not in a sad way, in a true way. I am not the work I do. I am not the person others think I am. I am not my worries or my memories. I am just here, like the trees, like the air, like the leaves. Taro thought about this. "But what's the point of being nothing?" "The point," Hideo said, "is that when you are nothing, you can be anything, or you can be nothing, and both are fine." They sat together for a while, the old man and the boy, in the middle of the forest, surrounded by nothing. Taro tried to feel what Hideo was describing, but he could not. His mind was too full of questions, of ideas, of the energy of being young, but he sat anyway, and in the sitting, something shifted, just a little. After a time, Hideo stood. "We should go back." They walked back together, and when they reached the village, Taro went home, his mind buzzing with thoughts. He did not understand what Hideo had said, but he felt it was important, like a seed planted that would take time to grow. Days passed, weeks. Taro stopped following Hideo, but he thought about him often. He thought about the path, about the nothing in the forest, about the idea that a person could be nothing and that could be fine. One morning, Taro woke early and decided to walk the path himself. He walked through the field, past the shrine, into the forest, and to the spot where Hideo always stopped. He sat on the rock and looked around. At first, he felt nothing, just boredom. and a slight annoyance at having woken so early. But he stayed because Hideo had stayed, and after a while the boredom faded. His mind, which was always racing, began to slow. He noticed the way the light filtered through the trees. He noticed the sound of a bird calling from somewhere far away. He noticed his own breath, rising and falling, and the way his body felt against the rock. He sat for an hour, maybe more, and when he finally stood to leave, he felt different. Not changed, exactly, just quieter, as if some of the noise inside him had been left behind in the forest. He began to walk the path himself, not every day, but sometimes, when the village felt too full, when the noise in his head became too loud, he would walk to the spot, sit on the rock, and let himself be nothing for a while. Years passed. Taro grew into a young man, then an older man. Hideo passed away, quietly, in his sleep, and the village mourned him in the simple way villages mourn, with a funeral, a few tears, and then a return to the work of living. But Taro continued to walk the path, and sometimes, when he sat on the rock in the forest, he would think of Hideo, and he would feel grateful for the old man who had taught him that it was okay to walk to nowhere, to be nothing, to simply sit in the quiet and let the world be what it was. One day, when Taro was old himself, a young girl followed him on the path. She was curious, bold, full of questions. When she finally revealed herself and asked why he walked to nowhere, Taro smiled. "Come," he said, "walk with me." And so the path continued, walked by one person, then another, each one carrying the same teaching forward, that it is okay to go nowhere, to be nothing, to simply walk and sit and breathe and let the noise of the world fade into the silence of trees. And the path itself, worn by footsteps but leading nowhere, remained patient and still, waiting for the next walker, the next question, the next quiet moment of understanding. The night deepens now. The stories have been told, the paths walked, the tea drunk, the stones split, the mountains climbed. And here we are, at the end of all things and the beginning of rest. You have listened, or perhaps you have drifted, moving in and out of these tales like breath moving in and out of the body. Either way, you have been here, and that is enough. More than enough. The world outside continues. The stars turn. The wind moves through empty places. Rivers flow, or they dry up, and stones sit where they have always sat, patient and still. But here, now, in this moment, none of that needs your attention. You can let go of the day. Let go of the questions you carried. Let go of the things you meant to do, the words you meant to say, the person you thought you should be. Let it all drift away like leaves on water, moving slowly downstream, out of sight, gone. Your body knows how to rest. It has been resting since the moment you were born, in the spaces between heartbeats, in the silence between breaths. Trust it now. Let your muscles soften. Let your thoughts slow and scatter like birds at dusk, finding their places to sleep. There is nothing left to do, nothing left to figure out. The stories have been told, and they will continue without you, the way rivers continue, the way mountains sit, the way dawn comes whether we are awake to see it or not. So close your eyes, if they are not closed already. Feel the weight of your body, held by the surface beneath you. Feel the quiet all around, the stillness that has been waiting for you all along, patient as stone, soft as snow. And as you drift now into sleep, into dreams, into the deep rest that asks nothing and gives everything. Know that you are exactly where you need to be, here, now, held by the night, carried by silence, free. Sleep now. Let the stories carry you. Let the mountains hold you. Let the stillness be your home. And when morning comes, as it always does, you will wake and the world will be waiting, and you will walk whatever path is yours to walk, carrying nothing, seeking nothing, simply being. But for now, rest. Deep, soft, complete. The night is yours. The silence is yours. And in that silence, everything you have ever needed is already here.